To the German High Command, the men of the 45th Division weren't even worth worrying about. Nazi propaganda sneered at them, calling them racially inferior, savages from the American West, undisciplined, primitive, barely soldiers at all. But on a hot July morning in 1943, as Allied forces stormed the shores of Sicily, General George S. Patton saw something else entirely. Standing behind his binoculars, watching the invasion unfold, he didn't see weakness, he saw a weapon. Where the Germans saw inferiority, Patton saw lethal focus, the kind that couldn't be drilled into a man on a parade ground. As regular army units struggled in the heavy surf, pinned down by mortar fire, overwhelmed by noise, smoke, and panic, one regiment was already moving forward with purpose. The men of the 180th were not frozen on the beach, they were advancing. They were the Thunderbirds. Thousands of them were Native Americans, Apache, Cherokee, Choctaw, Navajo. Men who, back home, were treated as second-class citizens. But on the scorched sands of the Mediterranean, they were becoming something else entirely, the most dangerous soldiers on the battlefield. Patton watched as they ignored the chaos that paralyzed others. They didn't pour out of the landing craft like frightened conscripts. They flowed out, quiet, coordinated, deliberate. No shouting, no hesitation. They didn't wait for shouted orders or officers fumbling over maps. One look at the dry, rocky hills rising beyond the beach, terrain that looked like the Badlands of New Mexico, and they already knew the play. The Germans, confident in their concrete bunkers, waited for a frontal assault that never came. The Thunderbirds were already on their flanks. They moved with a silence that unsettled seasoned enemy troops. Hand signals replaced radios. Bird calls cut through the chaos. By the time German machine gunners realized they weren't defending a beach but being hunted, it was already over. The U.S. Army had been hesitant to unleash these men. Washington worried they were too independent, too wild for a modern mechanized army. They wanted soldiers who marched in step. But Patton didn't want a parade. He wanted a breakthrough. When he saw the red and yellow Thunderbird patch on their shoulders, he smiled. He understood something the enemy didn't. These men weren't fighting for a dictator or an ideology. They were fighting for their land, their brothers, and a warrior tradition older than any flag on that beach. The Germans underestimated them. Their own government had marginalized them. But on the first day of the invasion, the so-called Apache Battalion was teaching the world what real power looked like. The beach was theirs, and now they were coming for the island. Before we go further, tell me where you're watching from. Wherever you are, may God bless you. Now, let's go deeper. To understand why these men fought differently, you have to understand where they came from. Most of the soldiers in the 180th Infantry didn't grow up on paved streets or city blocks. Many came from the Chilocco Indian Agricultural School in Oklahoma, a government institution designed to erase who they were. They were punished for speaking their languages, told to abandon their traditions, taught that their past had no place in the future. But you can't erase a heritage that runs in the blood. In the barracks of the 45th Division, you could hear a mix of languages that would have baffled any German intelligence officer: Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, Navajo. To the rest of the army and to the enemy, they were simply the Indians. But among them, the spirit of the Apache warrior stood tall, a reputation for endurance that bordered on the superhuman. There was a bitter irony to it all. These men were training to defend a constitution that didn't fully protect them. Back home, some of them couldn't even vote in the states they were drafted from. And yet, when the call came, they didn't hesitate. They formed a brotherhood tighter than any standard platoon. When they called each other brother, they meant it. While other units struggled under the Sicilian sun and crumbled under harsh conditions, the men of the 180th barely flinched. They were used to hard land, used to scarcity. They took the skills their grandfathers used to survive on shrinking frontiers, tracking, silence, patience, observation, and turned them into weapons. Without meaning to, the U.S. Army had created an elite force. Men raised to endure the impossible, handed rifles and uniforms, then aimed at the greatest evil the world had ever faced. The weapon was ready. Now it was time to pull the trigger. General Patton was not a patient man. By mid-July, the invasion was slowing. Roads were choked with rubble. German resistance was hardening. Inside his command tent, old blood and guts paced like a caged animal. He needed the Biscari airfield, a strategic prize that would give the Allies control of the skies. But the airfield was a fortress, defended by elite German paratroopers dug in deep. Conventional infantry assaults were getting shredded. Patton needed a sledgehammer. He didn't have one. So, he reached for a knife. He sent the 45th Division forward. This was the moment the legend of the Apache Battalion truly began, passed in whispers, not written in reports. You won't find the name in official records, but everyone at the front understood what it meant. Send these men in straight on, and they'd die like anyone else. Let them fight their way, and the rules changed. The officers of the 180th studied the map. The roads to the airfield were heavily defended. Then they noticed the broken, jagged terrain the Germans had ignored, written off as impassable. Orders moved quietly down the line. Drop the heavy packs. Fix bayonets. We're going off-road. Patton watched the reports roll in. The speed didn't make sense. They weren't waiting for tanks. They were outrunning them. That's when he realized these men weren't just following orders. They were racing each other to the fight. Patton demanded the impossible, take the airfield before the Germans could destroy the runway. The men of the 45th didn't argue. They tightened their bootlaces and moved. Night in Sicily is pitch black. Stone villages swallow the light. Olive groves turn into twisting mazes of shadow. For the average American soldier in 1943, night fighting was pure terror. You couldn't see the enemy. Air power was useless. The doctrine was simple: dig in and wait for dawn. But the Germans soon learned something the hard way. The night didn't belong to them. It belonged to the Thunderbirds. And as the men of the 180th closed in on the airfield, they didn't stop when the sun went down. This was their moment. They moved the way their ancestors had taught them, without compasses, without noise, guided by the stars and the shape of the hills against the night sky. They didn't rattle canteens. They didn't snap twigs underfoot. Every step was deliberate, every breath controlled. One German sentry after another vanished into the darkness before he could even raise an alarm flare. It wasn't just combat, it was psychological warfare. Imagine being a German soldier, confident in your defenses, only to realize your perimeter has been breached and no one knows how. No shots, no explosions, just men disappearing. Panic rippled through the German lines. They began firing blindly into the night, emptying magazines into shadows that didn't shoot back. Not yet. The Apache element of the 45th wasn't interested in trading fire from a distance. They were closing in, slipping inside the enemy's guard, crawling through irrigation ditches, climbing stone walls, getting so close they could smell cigarette smoke on German breath. They weren't rushing the fight, they were shaping it, setting the trap from the inside. By the time the first flare went up to signal open combat, the battle was already half over. The Germans thought they were facing an army. They didn't realize they were being hunted by ghosts. Then the sun rose, and stealth gave way to violence. The fight for Biscari Airfield wasn't a chess match, it was a fist fight with explosives. The defenders were from the Hermann Göring Division, elite Luftwaffe troops, young, hardened, fanatical. They answered with a storm of mortars and machine gun fire that turned the earth into choking dust. The heat soared past 100 degrees. Sweat soaked uniforms in minutes. Throats burned. Eyes stung. Men could barely breathe. Other units might have pulled back. The 45th did not. They advanced using marching fire, walking forward while firing from the hip, drowning the enemy in raw aggression. It was terrifying to witness. A sergeant from the Choctaw Nation charged a machine gun nest that had pinned down an entire company. No backup, no hesitation. He zigzagged through the fire, closed the distance, and silenced the gun with a single grenade. All across the airfield, the same scenes played out. Warriors from the American Southwest locked into brutal, close-quarters combat with the pride of Hitler's army. It was savage, it was personal, and slowly the discipline of the German defenders began to collapse. They had never faced an enemy that simply refused to stop. By early afternoon, the airfield fell silent. The runways were scarred and littered with debris, but they were American. When Patton arrived, his jeep kicking up dust, he surveyed the bodies of the enemy, then the exhausted Native American soldiers calmly cleaning their rifles. He didn't need to say anything. His eyes said enough. He had found his spearhead. But war doesn't allow rest. Before the dust even settled at Biscayne, new orders came down. The next objective was worse. Bloody Ridge, a jagged spine of rock near San Stefano, a natural fortress commanding the coastal road. The Germans had turned it into a killing ground, fortifying it with everything they had left. They held the high ground. Standard doctrine said you don't attack a position like that without massive artillery, but there was no time. The element of surprise was gone. The 180th was told to take the ridge. They looked up at the steep, exposed slopes. To most soldiers, it looked like suicide. To them, it looked like terrain. They split into small teams, dumped heavy packs, and began climbing, not along the trails, but straight up the rock faces the Germans believed were impassable. Observers later said they climbed like mountain goats, finding footholds where no man should have been able to stand. When the fighting started, it was sudden and vicious. German troops stared in disbelief as American soldiers emerged from cliff edges right beside their bunkers. Bloody Ridge was fought with knives, bayonets, and grenades. It was pure will against ideology. The so-called inferior warriors drove the so-called master race off the mountain, foot by bloody foot. They took the ridge, but the cost was brutal. Men who had grown up together, who had left the reservation together, lay lifeless on the Sicilian stone. The survivors stood on the peak, gasping for air, staring out over the Mediterranean. They had won, but they were alone. Radios crackled and died. Ammunition ran low. As night fell, a new sound rose from the valley below, the rumble of German tanks moving into position for a counterattack. They had climbed to the top of the world, only to find themselves isolated in the dark. In war, news travels fast. Fear travels faster. By early August, German intelligence officers were confused by intercepted reports from their own front lines. Seasoned soldiers, normally disciplined and controlled, were sending frantic messages about a specific group of Americans. They called them the warriors without screams. The Germans were used to Americans who shouted orders, whose radios never stopped crackling, whose heavy boots announced every movement. These men were different. They moved like smoke. Survivors spoke of being watched by eyes they could never see, of sentries found dead with their throats cut. Sometimes the only sign left behind was a single feather or a crude symbol scratched into the dirt, a deliberate psychological wound left by men who understood fear. The legend of the Apache Battalion spread from the foxholes of Sicily up through the chain of command. Even Allied leaders began to realize they had something rare, something dangerous. Patton himself, a man who often saw soldiers as tools in his machine, paused to give credit. He said that if he could keep them from going too wild, the men of the 45th were the finest combat soldiers he had ever seen. It was a backhanded compliment, shaped by the prejudices of the era, but it was also the truth. West Point manuals didn't teach men how to survive Bloody Ridge. Heritage did. But reputation comes at a price. When generals needed a unit for the dirtiest jobs, clearing minefields, storming fortified farmhouses, patrolling valleys crawling with panzers, they didn't send fresh troops, they sent the Thunderbirds. Victory didn't earn them rest, it earned them harder missions. And as the campaign dragged on, the men of the 180th began to understand a cruel reality. Being the best didn't mean surviving longer. It meant being the first to go. In the brief silences between battles, when the guns stopped and the dust settled, that truth sank in, heavy and inescapable. In the rare quiet moments, the men would sit beneath the twisted shade of olive trees, breaking down their M1 Garans, wiping dust from the metal and unfolding letters from home. Those letters were lifelines, but they cut deep. One corporal might read his mother's words from Oklahoma, describing how she'd been turned away from a general store because of her skin. Another read about yet another fight just to cast a vote back in New Mexico. There they were, thousands of miles from home, bleeding for a flag that still refused to fully claim them. It was the great American paradox, written in ink and sweat. So why fight like this? Why charge a machine gun nest for a country that treats you like a stranger? The answer wasn't politics. It wasn't slogans or speeches. You could see it in the way they split their rations without being asked, in the way they dragged wounded brothers out of fire, bullets snapping past, hesitation nowhere in sight. They weren't fighting for the generals in Washington. They weren't fighting for laws that kept them down. They fought for the land itself, even when it wasn't their own. And they fought for the man beside them. Their ancestors' warrior code was simple. Once you're on the warpath, you don't turn back. You protect your brother. You honor your strength. Shared suffering forged something unbreakable. Compared to a German Tiger tank, the racism back home felt distant, almost unreal. But another trial was coming. The Army wasn't just asking them to fight anymore. They were asking them to race. Patton had his eyes on Palermo, and he was obsessed with getting there before the British. What followed wasn't strategy, it was ego, paid for in blood and exhaustion. The order was brutal in its simplicity. Move fast, don't stop. The 45th Division was ordered to cover over 100 miles of savage mountain terrain in just days. Mechanized units struggled, trucks overheated, tanks threw tracks on the rock-strewn roads, but the men of the 180th kept walking. This was where the walking army earned its name. Blisters split open, water ran dry, the Sicilian sun scorched their backs, and still they marched. Observers couldn't believe the pace. Other units collapsed by the roadside, but the indigenous soldiers drew from something deeper than training, something ancient. They remembered the stories of grandfathers who could run down deer, the long migrations of their people. They found a rhythm, a trance where pain became background noise. They marched past stalled convoys, past British units paused for tea. When roadblocks and blown bridges tried to slow them down, the Thunderbirds didn't wait for engineers. They went around, down ravines, up cliffs, mortar plates and ammunition crates digging into their shoulders. When they finally crested the last hill and saw Palermo spread below, they looked like ghosts. Uniforms caked in white dust, eyes hollow from days without sleep. But they had made it. They entered Palermo not as a parade, but like a force of nature. Civilians threw flowers. The soldiers barely noticed. They were too tired to smile. They had broken the enemy's spirit and the army's speed records. Patton got his headlines, he got his glory, but the men who carried the spear knew the cost. They had walked through hell. Sicily was theirs. The island was conquered. Yet as they stared across the narrow stretch of water toward mainland Italy, they understood something chilling. The war wasn't finished. Italy's mountains were higher, winter was coming, and the Germans were waiting. The Sicily campaign lasted just 38 days, but it changed the men of the 45th forever. When the guns finally fell silent, the Apache Battalion had proven its point. They endured every insult, racial slurs, elite troops, fortified mountains, and crushed them all. Skepticism among American officers turned into something close to reverence. No one questioned their discipline anymore. No one questioned control. They were the tip of the spear, sharp, feared, lethal. But the tragedy comes after 1945. These men who liberated towns and broke the back of Nazi forces came home to a country that hadn't grown as much as they had. They traded rifles for reservation life. Purple Hearts and Silver Stars were tucked into drawers. Stories went untold. They went back to being second-class citizens, first-class heroes forgotten by law, remembered only by history. Among themselves and among those who fought beside them, the truth never faded. They proved the warrior spirit isn't defined by skin color, but by the fire in a man's heart. The legacy of the Thunderbirds isn't a footnote, it's a testament. They fought two wars, one against Hitler and one for their own dignity, and they won both. So the next time you see that yellow bird on a red diamond, remember the dust of Sicily. Remember the silence of the night patrols. Remember the men America was afraid to unleash, who turned out to be the men who saved the day. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Wherever you are in this world, stay safe, stay strong, and God bless.